I'm Rob Higuerita, and I'm an enterprise support lead based out of Austin, Texas. Welcome to AWS Supports You, where we share best practices and troubleshooting tips from AWS Support. Joining us today is Fatima Zara and Akash Sharan from AWS Support. Can you give us a quick introduction, Fatima, and then Akash?
Hey guys, very happy to be here. I'm Fatima Zara and I'm a cloud support engineer here at the AWS Dublin office in Ireland. I'm a member of the security profile supporting different AWS services in that domain. One which I specialize is AWS Config. I spend my day helping customers debug any issues or configuring or managing AWS security related services. Over to you, Akash.
Hey everyone, this is Akash, a cloud support engineer here at AWS office in Dallas, Texas. I'm a AWS Config subject matter expert, and I help AWS customers with securing their environment and using multiple services on a day-to-day basis. Over to you, Rob.
Great, thanks for the introduction, both of you. So in today's episode of AWS Supports You, we'll be discussing how to monitor and remediate non-compliant resources with AWS Config. But before we get into the details, a quick note to the attendees online. Please feel free to use the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen to share your thoughts and ask your questions throughout the episode. We have some experts here today, and we look forward to hearing from you all. Fatima, can you walk us through what we're going to be talking about today?
Of course. So in today's agenda, we're first going to talk about what is AWS Config and then how to enable AWS Config. We'll then look into resource and their configurations. Akash will then run through AWS config rules and remediation. We also have a demo, how to remediate non-compliant resources. After that, we'll look at Conformance pack, which is another way of deploying AWS config rules. And then we're going to move on to deploying rules across AWS Organization. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some best practices. So what is AWS Config? So AWS is constantly innovating so that we can provide our customers with the best choices in cloud services, resources, and software. With so many options, it can be challenging to make sure your resource configurations are efficient, secure, and comply with the best practices. So this is why we introduced our AWS Config service. With the service, you can easily assess, audit, and evaluate your configuration of your resources. When you enable config, it provides you with the resource inventory. Using the services, then you can define policies and rules for your AWS environment, receive notifications, and when a resource configuration deviates from these rules, you can then bring them back. So not only that, when a non-compliant resource is discovered with AWS Config, it provides automatic remediation so that you can get back to the compliant state and as soon as possible. So in short, this is a great service to monitor security weaknesses and track your resource configuration changes. So how does AWS work? So when you turn on config, it first discovers supported AWS resources that exist in your account and generates a configuration item for each resource. So Rob will send you a document link of support resources that we have in AWS config. With AWS config, it also generates a configuration item when a configuration of resource changes. So this is to maintain historical records. So typically it tracks all the changes of your resources by invoking describe and list API calls. So they're just read API calls for each resource in your AWS account. So when AWS config records the CI is then sent to an S3 bucket and optionally notified to SNS topics. So SNS is just a communication channel that Amazon SNS uses to deliver to subscribing endpoints. This could be like your email address. This could be your phone number, so you can get a text. And then it also evaluates the configuration change against the desired configurations, which are your rules. So we'll look into this in the later slides, but this is a diagram of how it generally works. So before I move on to the next slide, Rob, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, Fatima. Thanks. No questions right now from the audience. So, audience members, please take advantage of our experts here today and post your questions in our chat. Thanks, Fatima. Back to you.
Perfect, thank you. So how to enable config. So this is our starter page. So if you're in the AWS Management Console and you go onto the config service, this is the starter page that you'll see. So if you press get started, it will bring you to this page. And here you can see that, you have general settings. So these are your recorded settings. So this is to record all resources that are supported by config in this region. And then you also can pick particular resources if you want. And then we also have include global resources. So this is checkbox. It's up to you if you want to select it or not. And then underneath we have the config role. So as I mentioned earlier, config does call read APIs such as list and describe on your AWS account to create a configuration item. So this is the role that it'll be using. And then I will show you. So here is an example of, you basically selecting particular resources. In this example, I just have an API gateway API resource selected there. And then this is a delivery method. So config sends config data such as configuration history and snapshot files to AWS config, to your S3 bucket from AWS config. So here you have an option to create your own bucket from the starter page, or what you can do is select an existing bucket, or if you want to centralize everything and send data to one bucket, you can pick a bucket from a different AWS account, like maybe your central account. And then underneath, we have an optional configuration, which is Amazon SNS topic. So here you can, again, create your own, choose one that you have, or if you want to centralize the notifications, you can pick SNS topic in a different AWS account. Just make sure that you are picking the SNS topic in the same region that you are enabling this config. So once you kind of set up config, this is the dashboard that you'll see. So here you will see different types of resource types that are being recorded. So we've got like IAM policy, we've got config resource compliance. This is stores basically information that a config uses, and IAM role. And then we also have a total resources. So in this, I have 1,578 resources that are being recorded. So yeah, this is just an overview of the dashboard. So before we move on, I guess, Rob, do we have any questions before we move on to the next topic?
Hi, Fatima. Yes, we do have a question from the audience that came from Mr. Builder 10. How many CIs or rules can we create with config?
Sure, I can go ahead and take that one.
Sure.
So right now we do not have any limit for the configuration item. So it just depends on the number of resources in your account. So the more number of resources, the more number of CIs. And for the configuration rules, we do have a limit right now of we'll be able to deploy 250 rules per account per region, and you have the option to increase it as well.
Great. Thanks, Akash. Appreciate that. I do have one other question for you all as well. One of you are willing to take it. What global resources types does AWS Config record?
Yep, I can answer that one. So at the moment, we only record IAM resources. They're the only global resources that we have. We're hoping to obviously introduce more in the future, but at the moment, it's just IAM.
Great. Thanks. Back over to you all for the rest of the presentation.
Perfect.
Cool. Okay, so I can take on from here for the next topic. So how to check for resource configurations. So this is the config dashboard. And from here, we can just click on the resources tab from the left navigation pane. And this page will display like all the supported AWS resources recorded by config in your account and region. And from this page, you can select like a specific resource type using like a filter for resource type or the resource identifier. So in this case, I'm choosing like EC2 instances to look for like a specific EC2 instance in my account. And after I search for that specific instance, and after clicking on the EC2 instance, it will display like the resource name, resource type, the instance ID, and if you scroll down, you will also see the configuration item for this particular resource, which contains current configurations and metadata and attributes or the relationships for this specific EC2 instance. And from the same page, if you can go to the resource timeline as seen from the top right corner. So from there, you can this resource timeline page provides data like how the EC2 instance was configured, like at a specific date, like let's say 3 months ago, how was your EC2 instance configured, and CloudTrail events that were performed on the specific EC2 instance, like when it was stopped or again started, and configuration rule compliant events. This means that it will provide like details about when this EC2 instance was compliant or non-compliant for a specific config rule. And we can explore more about the next topic regarding AWS config rules and remediations. So you can evaluate the configuration settings of your AWS resources by creating multiple AWS config rules in your environment, which represent your ideal configuration settings. So we have two types of config rules: AWS managed config rules and custom config rules. So for AWS managed config rules, these are rules that are predefined and customizable that config uses to evaluate whether your resource is compliant or non-compliant, depending on the parameters and the settings that you have passed. And for custom config rules, these are the rules that you develop on your own, and you can add them to AWS config by associating them with a Lambda function. And the Lambda function has the logic on how you want to evaluate the resource and check for the compliance if it is compliant or non-compliant. And for these config rules, we have two types of triggers, which is like configuration changes trigger and periodic trigger. So for configuration changes trigger, rule evaluations are triggered when a certain type of resource is like created, deleted, or changed. And for periodic trigger, these type of triggers, the config rule will be evaluated at a specified frequency that you have mentioned when you deploy the rule. Like it can be 1 hour or 12 hours or 24 hours, depending on your use case. So moving on to the remediation action. So we after a config rule marks your resource for compliance, we can create remediation actions on the rule such that specific actions or changes are made on that resource whenever it is non-compliant. So basically, there are two types of remediation actions, which is like manual and automatic. And as the name suggests, for manual remediation, after you set up the remediation action, we have to select the non-compliant resource and click on the remediate button manually, which uses the start remediation execution API on the back end. And config then triggers the remediation action that is configured by calling start automation execution API to systems manager, which goes ahead and makes the changes on the resource while config listens for the status updates from SSM. And if everything is configured correctly, remediation will be successful and the resource will be compliant. And for automatic remediation, as the name suggests, again, you configure the remediation action, and after the rule evaluates a resource as non-compliant, config automatically triggers the SSM document by calling the start automation execution API to systems manager, which makes changes on the resource while config listens to the status updates. And again, similar to manual, if everything is configured correctly, remediation will be successful and the resource will be compliant. It's important to note that for automatic remediation, automation assume role parameter that is passed in the SSM document is mandatory, but for manual remediation, it is like an optional value. And let's move on to the demo that I'll be showing you, where I'll explain how to deploy like a config rule and set up like automatic remediation for this specific rule. Okay, so here is the demo, and this is the AWS config dashboard. And from here, we can go to the rules from the left navigation pane. And here we'll be able to add rule. And for this purpose of this demo, I'm choosing the rule S3 bucket server-side encryption enabled. Basically, this rule checks if an S3 bucket in your account is encrypted or not. And after I select the rule, I'm going ahead and like deploying this rule and add rule. So now the config rule is deployed in my account. So once I open the rule, and the rule will run evaluations on your account. So I have like a couple of S3 buckets in my account, and right now we do see that one of the S3 bucket is non-compliant. So in order to add remediation, we need to create like an IAM role. And for that, I'll be heading over to the IAM console to show you how we can create like a role and policy for this one. So from the IAM console, I'm going to policies, and I'm going to create a policy. And because the remediation here is I'm trying to encrypt the S3 buckets, I'll try to use the S3 service and select the put encryption configuration API to that will allow the automation assume role to encrypt the bucket. And now we go ahead and create a policy and provide like a policy name here. And I'm choosing S3 encryption policy in this case. And once we have the policy created, we will head over to the IAM roles section and create a role for the remediation action. And after while creating the role, I'll use systems manager, because as a systems manager, documents are the resources that are used for remediation. And I'll go ahead and add and select the policy that I just created and attach this to the role, to the automation assume role. And once we have that, I'll provide like a name for that specific role and make a note of the ARN for this specific role. And the role name I'm choosing here is S3 remediation role. And I'll save it. I'll save the ARN now. Once we have the policy and the role created, we can head over back to the AWS config console, where we have the config rule. And from here, I'll be able to add the remediation action by selecting actions and clicking on manage remediation. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm using automatic remediation here, and the SSM document that I'm using is enable S3 bucket encryption. So once we have the document selected, we need to pass the parameters for this remediation document. And for the bucket name, I'm going to choose resource ID as the bucket name, so that the remediation is triggered for that specific bucket which is non-compliant. And then I'll be pasting the ARN for the automation assume role, and the remediation action will be created. So now the remediation is added for this specific rule, and I do see I have like a couple of buckets that are non-compliant. So I'm going to run like a quick reevaluation such that the buckets are marked. Another rule evaluation is done after the remediation action was deployed, and now we see that the resource is still non-compliant. And now at the back end, the remediation action will be triggered, and we'll see in a few minutes. Okay, we already see that the remediation status is action executed successful. And after giving it like a couple of minutes, we'll see that uh, both the S3 buckets will be compliant for this specific rule. And yeah, here we go. Yeah. So right now in this demo, we observed how to deploy like an AWS config rule that checks if an S3 bucket is encrypted or not. And we added the remediation such that the buckets that are not encrypted, for those buckets, automatically encryption is enabled. And that brings us to the end of the specific demo. And do we have any questions, Rob, regarding these topics?
Thanks, Akash. Yeah, I have a couple questions. One for myself. Can we have multiple remediation actions for one config rule?
Sure. So at the moment, like we can only add like one remediation action per config rule. However, this is like a feature request that that can be looked into.
Okay, great. Thanks. And then we have a question from the audience from Tame242, and it's how would I exempt resources from being evaluated by a rule?
Okay, I can take that one. So when you're creating a rule, you can actually define the scope of the rule. So it depends on the use case, but if you are, maybe looking at different resource types, so you have like S3 buckets and you have EC2 instances, what you can actually pick is tags, and you can tag those particular resources so that the rule is only evaluating those resources based on tags. So that's a way of evaluating resources that you want for that particular rule.
Great. All right. Thanks, Autumn. I appreciate that. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Perfect. So I'll take it from here.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're going to talk about conformance packs. So what is a conformance pack? So before this config released the conformance pack feature, you would need to create config rules individually per region per account. So you would do that using put config rule API. But now after conformance packs, you can now deploy multiple rules at the same time per region. So this conformance pack is essentially just a collection of rules and remediation actions, which you can define with a template, which can be YAML or JSON, and you can have up to 130 rules per pack. How you do this is you call the put conformance pack API, or you can do it through the management console. And then after deploying the conformance pack, you can then review the compliance of your resources at pack level. So leaving you to only focus on conformance packs and that are non-compliant rather than looking at each rule individually. So it simplifies things a lot. So here is an example of a template. So here you can see the resources here. Okay, where's my mouse? Okay, so here you can see that there's an S3 bucket server-side encryption enabled. So this is the same rule that Gosh did in his demo. I just wanted to show you a different way of how to do this. So this is the rule, and then we have the other resource, which is the remediation action. So you can see that depends on. So here we have the rule config rule name, and then here we have the source identifier. So the source identifier you can actually find from our public documentation from the list of managed rules, which Rob will link in the chat for you guys as well. And then we have our remediation name, and then we have the SSM document that we're using. So that's target ID, AWS enable S3 bucket encryption. And then we also have here automatic false. So this for this template, and the demo that I'm going to do in a second, I just wanted to change things up a bit. So I've set this to false, meaning that it's going to be a manual remediation and not an automatic one, just like in the previous demo. So we will now go into the demo. So perfect. So let me just go from the start. Okay, so this is the config dashboard. So we click onto the config dashboard, and you're in the dashboard now. So we're going to go to the navigation pane and go to conformance pack. We're going to now deploy a conformance pack. And then we're going to use the same template that we just looked at. So I'm going to upload the template and upload it from my local machine, and then choose file. So I already have it saved as a YAML template, and then open. So then next, okay, so now we're deciding the conformance pack name. So I'm just going to call it S3 conformance pack. And then I'm just going to go next. And then there are my details. So I'm just going to deploy the conformance pack. So the purpose of this video, I'm just going to focus on how to create a conformance pack using the template. And then the one thing to note here is after a conformance pack is deployed, you cannot change the name of the conformance pack. So just choose your name carefully. And then, okay, so we're just going to give it a second. We can see here that the deployment status is in progress over here. And we're just waiting now. Give it a second. It's okay, so it's completed. So now we're just going to click onto the conformance pack. And we only had one rule, so you can see it there. So we're going to click on to the rule. Okay, so this is how it looks like. So this is the rules page. And then we can see that there's a remediation action already set because we had it in the template. And it uses the AWS enabled S3 bucket encryption document. And then we have the resources in scope. So we're just going to give it a second for the rule to just evaluate because we just created this. So I'm just going to press refresh there. Okay, so we can see that there are 2 buckets in this account that Config recorded. So I'm just going to select one of the buckets manually, and I'm going to press remediate. Okay, so we can now see the status is action executed successfully. So now the SSM document is running. So we're just going to give it another second. So in this, what's happening is that the SSM document is going to run a put bucket encryption API, but this time instead of using an automation assume role, it's going to use your user credentials. So with manual remediation, if you don't provide an automation assume role, it will use your user credentials. So that's why it's optional. Okay, so I'm just going to press refresh again and see. Okay, just give it another second. Okay, hopefully third time lucky. And yeah, perfect. So now we can see that the compliance status is compliant, meaning that the encryption is enabled on this bucket. Okay, so just to recap, in order to perform a remediation action, you need to make sure that the resource is non-compliant, and then you can manually remediate this resource. So I'm just going to move back to the slides. Okay, so before I move on, Rob, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, Fatima. Yeah, I have a question. And overall, how many config rules can we deploy in one conformance pack?
Okay, yeah, so you can deploy up to 130 rules in a conformance pack. This could change in future, but this is what it is right now.
Okay, thanks. And I do have one question that just came in from Tommy242 as well. She said, I don't know if we missed this and I'm new to AWS Config, but when do we use conformance pack versus rules, or do we use them together?
Sure, I can go ahead and take that one. So generally for AWS config rules, it's like you can just deploy one rule at a time. But for conformance packs, it's like an entity that you can deploy multiple rules. So as Fatima mentioned, you can deploy up to 130 config rules, and you can have like multiple remediation actions set up in the CloudFormation template, in the template that we are using as well. So instead of this will give you like an easier way to organize and deploy this to multiple accounts. So that Fatma is also going to go through how to deploy a conformance pack to organizations. But basically, it's an entity where you can deploy multiple rules at one single time. And there are use cases where you want to apply only one rule, so you can absolutely use both together as well.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that. So I'll turn it over to you, Fatima, to cover deploying rules across the AWS organizations.
Perfect. So yes, okay, so deploying rules across AWS organizations. So there are 2 ways you can do this. So there's put organization config rule and put organization conformance pack. So put organization config rule is deploying a config rule across your member account, but this is a single deployment. So there's one rule being deployed. And remediation action is actually, the feature is not supported with this API. And then we have put organization conformance pack, which is a bulk deployment of rules, which remediation is supported, and you can deploy this across your member accounts in your organization. Just to bear in mind, when you are using these APIs, this is still per region basis. These APIs are currently not supported by the AWS Management Console yet, so you do have to use a CLI or SDK to call these APIs. And at the moment, these two APIs are not supported by all AWS regions. So we do have document links for you guys to double check if the region support for AWS Config rules and region support for conformance packs. And over to you, Akash, for AWS Config best practices.
Sure, thanks, Fatima. So now we can look at the best practices for AWS Config. We have like a couple of blog posts that link config best practices and best practices for conformance packs as well. And Rob is going to provide the link for you regarding that. And so the first, I'll go over like few important ones here. First thing is to enable AWS Config in all of your accounts and regions. This is an industry best practice that is recommended by Center for Internet Security, that is CIS. And we need to record configuration changes to all resource types. So when you're setting up AWS Config, as we saw, like you can select all resources for the resource types such that this ensures that there is like a comprehensive configuration audit in place for all your accounts and regions. And AWS also supports like more than 100 different resource types in AWS, and there are the services constantly innovating, and new resource types are constantly being added. So selecting all resource types will also automatically start recording any new resources that are being supported. And we should record global resources such as like IAM resources only in one region. This ensures that you don't get redundant copies of your IAM configuration items in every region. And this also helps for you to like optimize the costs related to AWS Config. And the another best practice is to use conformance pack in your account as well as organizations. As explained, like this will help you like deploy multiple rules and remediations in your account at a single go. And you can also deploy a conformance pack centrally from your delegated admin account or your management account. So delegated admin account is one of the member account in your organizations, which you can use for just for security purposes. So from that account, when you deploy an organization conformance pack, the rules will be deployed to all the accounts in your organization. And that brings us towards the end of the demo and the live learning. So to give a quick recap, now we learned how to monitor and remediate non-compliant resources with AWS Config in your AWS environment. Do we have any other questions, Rob, for us today?
We just have one last question that came in just a second ago from MJB Galaxy. Question on the cost of config. Do you have a baseline for what the average cost is for AWS config?
Sure. So in config, there are three ways how you can be charged. So that will be configuration items recorded in your account, config rule evaluations, and conformance pack evaluations. So for configuration items, it is $0.003 per configuration item recorded in your account and region. And for the rule evaluations as well, depending on the tiers and like the number of rules you have, like it is generally $0.001, and it is similar to conformance packs as well, with $0.0012 per rule evaluation. I can definitely link in the AWS config pricing page for more details, but these are the three different prices that config incurs.
Thanks, Akash. Appreciate that. I'll go ahead and copy and paste the link here.
I would just like to add one thing. We also have really, really good AWS blogs on config costs, where they literally help you evaluate cost of your config, and then you can use the price calculator to see if it matches up. So definitely check them out. We'll try and link them in here as well. But yeah, definitely check out the public blogs that we have on the costs.
Great. Thank you both. Appreciate that. So
Awesome.
everyone, today we looked at AWS Config with the focus on how to monitor your resources and remediate those resources when they're non-compliant. If there are any questions that weren't answered today, you can post your questions on forums.aws.amazon.com. Please feel free to email us any feedback to awssupportsyou@amazon.com. We want to hear from you and let us know what you'd like to see on this show. Additionally, thanks to our moderators. We'll be posting here your awssupportsyou.splashthat.com where you can bookmark this page, and we hope that you'll be able to join us next time by registering for our events. In closing, thanks for joining us today at AWS Supports You, and we hope you have a happy cloud computing.